Welcome to the Wartime Diaries, where wars become stories. The story of Sudan starts with a line drawn not on the ground, but in the mind. For centuries, this land was a meeting place, a busy marketplace of cultures. Arab traders came from the north, powerful African kingdoms rose in the south, herders moved with the seasons. Then came British-Egyptian rule. They did not unite these people. They split them on purpose. The north was groomed to be Arab and Muslim. The south was closed off, with few schools and even fewer roads. This was not just government. It was a policy of separation, a quiet division long before any map showed it. In the north, the capital, Khartoum, grew with offices and mosques connected to Cairo. Arabic was the language of power and ambition. In the south, English books and Christian teachings thrived, but there were not enough teachers or doctors. Northern officials were kept out of the south. It was like a dam had been built, creating to different worlds, to different educations, to different dreams for Sudan's future. When everyone spoke of independence, these cracks were already there, like tiny fractures in glass. After World War II, the wind of freedom blew across Africa, but it found a divided house in Sudan. Northern leaders debated their role in the Arab world. Southern leaders begged for self-rule for anything but being swallowed whole. Britain, in a hurry to leave, handed over the government to Sudanese officials, but out of 800 top jobs, only 6 went to Southerners. The message was clear: unity would mean being ruled by the North. Fear did the rest. Southern soldiers heard rumors that harsh Northern troops were coming to replace them. On August 18, 1955, in the town of Torrid, the Southern Corps rebelled. They killed Northern officers and ran into the wild. The rebellion was crushed quickly, but the fire had jumped from the army to the people. The first deaths were not just numbers in a report. They were screams in doorways, huts set on fire, families running for their lives into the forest. Britain lowered its flag and left. In January 1956, Sudan raised its new flag over a capital filled with both celebration and suspicion. The army, the government, the ministries, almost all were northern, almost all centered in Khartoum. They spoke of unity, while the South counted how few of their voices were in the room. Independence was not a happy union. It was a shaky truce over an unfinished argument. The North spoke of its destiny. The South remembered Torrid. In the following months, the government promised peace that never came. Soldiers swept through the southern countryside, hunting for bandits. What the South saw were old patterns with new uniforms, patrols, punishments, and officials who treated their land like conquered territory. This violence did not yet look like a civil war. It looked like a fever that in markets and mission yards, people learned a new vocabulary. Any Anya rebel group, Equatoria, mutiny, words that tasted like metal on the tongue. The first refugees crossed into Uganda and Congo, carrying stories the world would not hear and would not believe if it did. A nation was born, yes, but one half of it felt like an afterthought. The other half acted like it was the only one writing the story. Sudan stepped onto the world stage already limping. What began as a division of classrooms and checkpoints had become a division of memory and fear. In the north, the story was about order under threat. In the south, it was about dignity being stolen. Between them lay a silence, and into that silence, guns would soon speak. The first Sudanese civil war did not start with a declaration. It started with a whisper that no one in power bothered to hear. The fire that started in Torrid spread fast across the southern provinces. The mutiny became a disease. Soldiers fled into the forests and swamps, forming small bands of fighters. The government in Khartoum called them bandits, but these bandits learned quickly. They attacked convoys at night and vanished by dawn into the maze of rivers. The north called it a rebellion. The south called it survival. This war had no front lines. The front line was everywhere fear lived. Villages became traps of rumor. A wrong word to a stranger could mean death. Soldiers burned crops, accusing farmers of hiding rebels. Rebels struck back, ambushing army posts and burning supplies. The violence was a circle with no end, and the world outside Sudan hardly noticed. But slowly, a purpose began to form. By the early 1960s, the scattered resistance found a name, the Enyanya. It meant snake venom in the Mahdi language. It was a promise. The South would no longer beg. It would bite. In exile, Southern leaders tried to turn the scattered anger into a political movement. They met in Uganda, Congo, and Ethiopia, searching for unity but often finding distrust. Each tribe had its own pain, each leader his own ambition, but a quiet understanding was growing. The South's struggle was not just tribal, it was a fight for its very existence. Meanwhile, the North was falling into its own chaos. The dream of independence soured into a cycle of coups. Civilian governments rose and fell. Generals replaced generals. The army, built to defend unity, was now being destroyed by it. To the rulers in Khartoum, the Southern War was a distraction they used to tighten their grip and rally Arab identity against the African periphery. They used religion as a weapon. They used hunger as a weapon. By the late 1960s, the war's cost was unbearable. Nearly 500,000 people were dead, most of them civilians. Whole towns were silent, their schools and churches burned, their roads swallowed by jungle. Children were born knowing only the sound of running, but from this exhaustion came a small chance for peace.
The North signed because it was tired, not because it believed. The South accepted because it had to, not because it trusted. The agreement promised reconciliation, but no one knew what that really meant. The war had not ended. It was only holding its breath. The silence after the Addis Ababa agreement felt like a miracle. After 17 years of horror, the air was clear of gunfire. In Juba, children who had grown up hiding in swamps now walked to school. The Southern Regional Government was born a fragile experiment in self-rule. But the Northern President, Jafar Nimeri, saw the peace as a problem to be managed, not a partnership to be honored. For a few years, the illusion held. Foreign investors arrived, but this new wealth barely touched the South. The old unfairness had just put on a new suit. Then came the discovery that would poison the peace: oil. Large amounts of oil were found in the borderlands. Nimeri, unwilling to let the South control this treasure, quietly redrew the map, placing the oil fields under Northern control. The money flowed north, while anger began to seep back southward, like poison through sand. As the years passed, Nimeri changed. He began talking about national purification. Mosques were promoted, alcohol was banned, and the idea of Sharia law crept into his speeches. To the Christian and animist South, this was not unity. It was erasure. Inside the Southern government, old divisions returned. Rivalry led to corruption and fighting. The dream of self-rule was turning sour. Many Southerners wondered if they had just traded one master for another. In Khartoum, Nimeri watched and waited. By 1980, he began taking apart the peace agreement, piece by piece. The Southern Army was dissolved. The South was split into 3 smaller, easier-to-control provinces. Then, in 1983, the dam broke. Nimeri declared that Sharia law would apply to the whole country. In the town of Buro, a Southern battalion refused to obey. Their leader was a Dinka officer named John Garang. Garang did not fight for revenge. He fought for an idea, a new Sudan. But ideals, like oil, can ignite easily. Within weeks, Garang's soldiers took to the bush. The peace that had lasted 11 years collapsed in a single season. When the guns roared again in 1983, it was with a new purpose. The rebellion in Buro was not a scared mutiny. It was the birth of a movement with a mission. At its heart was Colonel John Garang. He dreamed not just of Southern separation, but of a new Sudan, a country rebuilt on equality and democracy. Garang's vision created an army, the Sudan People's Liberation Army SPLA. Its ranks filled with former soldiers, students, and farmers, anyone who had lost a home to Khartoum.
But belief was not enough. They needed guns and money. The SPLA struck across the South. Government troops, poorly trained and angry, hit back with fury. Entire villages were wiped off the map. The North called it counterinsurgency. The South called it extermination. By 1985, the war had eaten up the southern third of the country. Towns like Bor became names whispered in fear. Fields were empty, schools were gone, and famine followed the armies like a shadow. The Sudanese government, desperate to keep control, unleashed militias with no rules. In the name of unity, they committed atrocities that would scar generations. But the SPLA was no saint. Its talk of liberation was undermined by its own harsh rule. People who disagreed disappeared. Civilians were trapped between the monsters. Government soldiers by day, rebels by night. In the end, every ideal was swallowed by the need to survive. Meanwhile, the North was also crumbling. Inflation made money worthless. The cost of war emptied the country's treasury. Then, in June 1989, the last pieces of Sudan's democracy collapsed. A coup led by a little-known officer, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, swept the government away. Behind him stood the mastermind of Sudan's Islamist movement, Hassan al-Turabi. Together, they promised order, purity, and the rule of God. In his first speech, Bashir's voice was calm, but for the South, the message was unmistakable. A holy war had begun when Omar al-Bashir seized power. Sudan woke up to a new kind of dictatorship, one dressed in the language of God's salvation. Bashir announced a holy mission to unite the country under God. From the capital, sermons thundered that the war in the South was no longer political. It was jihad. The government's new soldiers were promised heaven. Their enemies were promised hell. This was no longer a war to hold land, but to change souls. Government planes dropped leaflets by day and bombs by night. They targeted markets and hospitals. Whole towns were labeled rebellious and burned to the ground. To the men in Khartoum, faith justified everything. To the civilians in the South, it was no different from genocide. The SPLA fought on, but winning was a dream. John Garang's forces were breaking apart inside. Ethnic divisions, fights for power, and hunger weakened the movement. In 1991, two of Garang's top commanders split from the SPLA, accusing him of being a tyrant. Their new faction turned its guns on their former friends, starting a war within the war. Civilians paid the price. Thousands were killed in tribal revenge killings. Whole communities were driven from their homes by men who had once fought together. By the early 1990s, famine became a weapon. Khartoum blocked aid convoys, arguing they would feed the rebels. Aid groups were kicked out. Fields lay empty. In one region, starving families ate tree bark and mud. Mothers buried their babies in unmarked graves. The famine of 1998 alone killed over 70,000 people, most of them children. International reporters called it a famine by design. At the same time, Bashir's Sudan became a home for global extremism. After being kicked out of Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden arrived in 1991 with his men. For a short time, Khartoum became an unlikely capital for militant Islam. The West responded by turning away. The United States put Sudan on its list of terror sponsors. Sanctions followed, but this isolation only made Bashir's grip stronger. The government began to profit from the oil discovered in the south. The first pipelines pumped wealth straight to Khartoum, making generals rich while war zones starved. But even in his triumph, cracks were appearing, and through those cracks, the faintest light of diplomacy began to appear. The holy war that promised salvation had brought only famine, sanctions, and shame. The peace talks that began in 2002 were long and difficult, but by 2005, a deal was reached. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement (CPA) was signed. It gave the South 6 years of self-rule, followed by a vote. Unity or independence. John Garang became first vice president of Sudan, but just 3 weeks later, his helicopter crashed in the mountains. He was killed. The South was plunged into grief and rage, but his deputy, Salva Kiir, took over. He was a quieter, more cautious man, but he held the movement together. For 6 years, the South prepared for its vote. On January 9, 2011, the people of South Sudan spoke. The result was overwhelming, 99% for independence. People danced in the streets. They cried old tears. For the first time, the South was not fighting for freedom. It was holding it in its hands. In Khartoum, Omar al-Bashir had little choice but to accept. The world had watched the vote closely. On July 9, 2011, under a wide blue sky, the old flag of Sudan came down. The new flag of South Sudan went up. The crowd erupted. South Sudan was the world's newest nation. For the first time in memory, there was hope. Foreign leaders praised the victory of democracy. Aid convoys rolled in. Across Africa, people called it a miracle, the end of the continent's longest civil war. But independence, though glorious, was fragile. The new country was built on ruins. Decades of war had left no real government, no roads, and no strong national identity. The SPLM, the movement that had fought for freedom, now had to learn to govern. And it was a clumsy, corrupt transition. Power was concentrated in the hands of President Salva Kiir, a Dinka. His deputy, Riek Machar, a Nuer, was his opposite, ambitious and hungry for power. Old rivalries came back. Tribal loyalty became more important. Oil, which had fueled the South Streams, became its curse. When the two Sudans argued over fees, South Sudan shut off the oil, choking its own economy. Both nations suffered, and both blamed the other. In Khartoum, The loss of oil money was a disaster. Prices soared. Food became too expensive. Protests simmered. The government cracked down. Bashir survived by empowering a new generation of loyal fighters, the Rapid Support Forces RSF. These troops were led by a young warlord named Hemedi. They became Bashir's favorite weapon. Meanwhile, in the newborn South, the joy of independence turned sour. By late 2013, tensions between Kir and Massacre exploded into open fighting in the capital. Soldiers turned on each other along ethnic lines. Civilians were murdered in their homes. Juba was burning. The civil war that followed proved that a nation born in freedom could die in division. Now there were two Sudans, side by side, mirror images of chaos. In the north, Bashir clung to power through fear and faith. In the south, Kir and Massacre tore their new country apart for revenge. The borders had changed, but the curse remained the same. By the late 2010s, Omar al-Bashir's empire was rotting from the inside. 30 years of dictatorship had drained Sudan dry. The oil money was gone, stolen by corruption. Inflation went crazy. Bread and fuel disappeared. Khartoum was a city of long lines, frustration, and quiet anger. In December 2018, the spark was lit. The price of bread tripled overnight. Students poured into the streets, shouting, "Just fall." That's all. The chant spread faster than any army could stop it. This was not a rebellion of guns, but of voices. And for the first time, Sudan's people moved as one. For months, people faced live fire, arrests, and torture, but they did not stop. They had seen too many false dawns to accept another. By April 2019, the unthinkable happened. The army turned on its master. Bashir, after 30 brutal years, was wrested by his own generals. Crowds flooded the streets in victory. For a shining moment, Sudan stood on the edge of a new beginning. The dictator was gone. The people had one. But in Sudan, revolutions have always been followed by the ghost of betrayal. The generals who removed Bashir quickly saw the danger of real democracy. They formed a military council, promising elections. Then came June 3, 2019. At dawn, RSF troops surrounded the protest camp and opened fire. Hundreds were killed. Bodies were thrown into the Nile. The massacre shattered the illusion that the old regime was dead. It had just changed its uniform. A shaky joint government was formed, but the old powers worked in the shadows to sabotage it. In October 2021, the military struck again. Tanks rolled through Khartoum. The civilian
Meanwhile, a new poison was growing. Hemedi's RSF had become a state within a state and army of tens of thousands. The leader of the regular army, Burhan, saw Hemedi as both a tool and a threat. By early 2023, their partnership had become a death trap. Talks about merging their forces collapsed in mistrust. On April 15, 2023, the silence broke. Fighter jets screamed over the capital. Explosions shook the city. The National Army and the RSF turned on each other. Two men, two armies, one capital. What began as a revolution had become a relapse into Sudan's oldest story, the fight not for freedom but for power. What began as a fight between two generals has, by late 2025, become something much worse. The war for Khartoum has consumed all of Sudan. What remains is not a country at war, but a country being erased in real time. The true horror has now moved west to Darfur. The RSF marches through villages under a banner of revenge and profit. One city, El-Fasher, fell not in battle, but in slaughter. Survivors tell of men shot in front of their families, of women taken away. Whole neighborhoods were burned to ash. Satellite photos now show hundreds of new mass graves so large they can be seen from space. The United Nations calls it the most systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing in modern Sudanese history. By late 2025, more than 14 million Sudanese have fled their homes, the largest displacement crisis on Earth. Inside Sudan, law has completely vanished. Civilians exist only as pawns in a game with no rules. In Khartoum, there is nothing left to fight for. The city is now a skeleton. The war has eaten not just lives, but all meaning. And yet, in the dust, tiny pieces of humanity remain. A teacher in a refugee camp, a nurse with boiled rainwater, a mother whispering to her child that peace will come. 70 years have passed since this land was set on fire. Every generation has inherited the same war under a different name. And as the famine spreads and the graves multiply, the question that has haunted Sudan since its birth returns one last time.
Was there ever truly one Sudan to begin with?